We're going to get into this topic of form here. And to get into it, we're going to start with binary form. It's a basic building block for a lot of other things. You'll see that even ternary form, which is three-part, takes binary form and makes it a smaller unit within it. So just a little foreshadowing here. If you've got ternary, you've got three parts. And if you were to look at especially a first and third part, which are both amaterial, in other words, they're the same basic content thematically, the B is the contrast. If you were to look at the A material in particular, you're going to usually see that it's binary form. I mean, almost always it's binary. So binary takes its place here as the A material's form. And then you create the ternary by repeating the A but creating some contrast in the middle. And really that's what form is about. It's about how do you keep things interesting. You're going to have something familiar. You're going to have some sort of return, but you're also going to have some kind of contrast, or it's going to get real dull. You don't want everything to be just A, all the same all the way through, or else you're going to lose the interest of your audience. But you don't want everything so different, so contrasting that there isn't any cohesiveness to it. So this idea of statement and return with some kind of contrast in between is big for form. And form basically is a way to see how those kinds of patterns play out. Now we're going to start with binary form because, like I said, it's a basic building block from which you get other larger forms. Binary means two, just like bicycle. Bi means two. So there are definitely two parts to this. Sometimes because I like really clean definitions, I would like it to mean that there are two periods. And a lot of times that's true, but there are all these pieces that are called two reprise, and they fit into this category as well. So binary forms are two-part in a couple ways. One is it can be two reprise. In other words, if you look at the page, you'll see these two repeated sections. Reprise is to bring back, and this is a reprise, this is a reprise. Two reprises make it two reprise form. That is one kind of binary form. That doesn't say anything about what kind of closure there might be here, and so it doesn't say that that's necessarily a period. Now, on a small scale, this might be a single phrase repeated. That's two reprise form. This might be a period, especially if it's a big thing. This, on a large scale, maybe a couple phrases long here. This is probably a period, but it doesn't have to be. Now, the traditional way of let me lay this out another way here. So, two, period. Okay. If you have, say, an opening idea, maybe it's a parallel period, some kind of period. If you've got a period, you've got closure. And the traditional way of looking at form is all about endings. Not so much about content, but about endings, because it's like they modeled their ideas of form on grammar. So the traditional viewpoint is to look for points of closure and say, that's a chunk, that's a part, that's a unit. It's a period. So you got your punctuation mark there saying, I'm done. And then if you have another unit, I don't care how many phrases it is, but the main thing is that you've got a period, and again, you're going to have closure here. So probably PAC and PAC there. That makes two periods. Two again, and so it fits into this category of binary form. All right, so you can define a binary form as being two-part in two different ways. One way is to say there's closure in the middle and there's closure at the end, and that defines two parts. The other way is to say there are two repeated chunks of music, and that makes it two-part and therefore binary. So these are two different ways of viewing binary form, and both work. Now for a lot of pieces, it's both. you've got two repeated chunks of music, and each of them forms a period with closure here and here, these two spots. So it's both. It will qualify as binary on either one of these bases. So now that we've got that basic definition down, binary, two-part, and in what sense is it two-part, now we can move on to, well, how do we get that pattern of contrast and return? Here we talked about ABA, and a lot of times you're going to get that in binary form as well. You're going to get, I'm going to use a lowercase a because we're talking about small scale things. So if I'm talking about, like phrases, I'm going to use lowercase a. If I'm talking about whole sections, I'm going to use a like this. Now this is on a small scale. We might again have two phrases forming this opening section, section 1. So that's at that scale, pretty small. We might have some B material here, and then A returning there. ABA again. Now, why isn't that ternary? Well, remember, the traditional way of looking at it, viewing form, is to say there's closure. There's closure. 2 points of closure, binary, or two repeated sections. So this pattern, which looks three-part here, has to do not with closure or repeated sections, but it has to do with the content, contrast and return. That's a very different thing. That does not make it ternary. Okay, so now, what creates this kind of contrast? This kind of contrast up here is like new theme, new texture, new meter, new key. Everything changes very abruptly, so there's a clear divide between these different parts. Complete contrast, new themes. Here, the B material in a binary form, this is another word for this B stuff, is digression. So you've got statement, digression, and then a sense of recapitulation, return going on. This kind of contrast in the digression is not so stark. It's not like you've got a new theme. In fact, normally you've got old material, A material's motives, coming back here, but you're developing them, you're using them in new ways. Some of the ways that might happen, you could take an old motive that you've heard before, it's familiar to you now, and you sequence it. It's sort of digressive because usually a sequence carries you somewhere, might move you to a new key even. And it definitely cuts you loose. You're not cycling through the phrase model, harmonic functions taking back to tonic, but the sequence is run by intervals, as we know. And that can just carry you maybe up or down. You're cutting loose from your moorings, and you're in a sense of process and motion rather than staying inside the orbit of one tonic. So I might as well put a modulation in here. These digressions tend to modulate. What's another way we could... There's a totally different thing that can happen. Pedal tone. And I'm talking about in the bass. A lot of times it's scale degree 5. That's a real common bass note to just hang out. It'll serve as a pedal tone, sometimes for the whole digression. Sometimes it comes in a little later. If it doesn't take up the whole thing, if I had to guess, I would say it'd come at the end. Because at the end, you can move to 5 and maybe just have it as a pedal, so you got harmonic change up above it, but you realize that you're elaborating the dominant, stretching it out for a chunk of time, all in preparation for a return to tonic there, when the A comes back perhaps. But that kind of pedal tone is building anticipation for the return of tonic. You're on something unstable, you're hanging on to it, and you're ready for some sort of resolution, and then you get it. You get a sense of return in two ways if these two coincide. You're getting a return of thematic material, fully articulated, the theme coming back, this idea coming back here, and you're getting the sense of return in terms of harmony. Your tonic is back as well. Okay, so those are some of the things that can happen to create a sense of contrast and return. And notice, all that's happening within the second reprise or the second period, part 2 of your binary form. Okay, there are some terms that I need to present to you too. I'm tending here with this digression to portray one particular one that is very common. I'm going to have you look at this thematic design sheet here, because this is the sheet I want you to look up. It's all about binary form. It defines it at the top. Division of a unit of music into two sections, either because one, there are two periods, or because there are two repeated sections, two reprise form. I give some typical harmonic plans, but I'm going to jump down. Okay, now here we just covered typical sources of contrast early in the second section. Motivic development, sequencing, modulation, and pedal points. Good, okay, so we covered a lot of that. And I didn't really make a point out of it, but that motivic development came up when we said it's not a new theme, it's old motives reused, transformed in different ways. Okay, so here I want to jump down to labels. There are two main parts to a label for binary form. One has to do with thematic design, the other has to do with the harmonic structure. Let's start with thematic design since that's top here. 3 labels to choose from. It's either rounded, balanced, or simple. You've probably heard those before. Rounded is the most common. And rounded means just like when a circle comes back around. You turn your wheel and you're back where you began. So in this, up here, already I've got this kind of format. This is rounded. When the beginning, you cycle back and you get back to A at the end. That's why it's rounded. You've rounded it off, you people say. So, departure and return at the end. Now, it's the opening idea, A material, coming back partway through the second section. That is rounded. So, let me make that kind of small over here, and we'll just kind of line up these patterns. I know I'm making that look like 2 reprise form, but remember, it could just be 2 periods and you wouldn't see any double bars in the score. And you wouldn't hear any repetitions, perhaps. But I'll use that to kind of lay it out as being parts 1 and part 2. Now, if it's rounded, the opening material, if we're calling A, comes back here, and you've got some kind of contrast there. Rounded. Okay, the next one on our list there is balanced. So, let me write it up here as well. Balanced. Use the double bars and repeats to mark off the 2 sections again. Balanced means that whatever this did to end it, whatever motive closes out section 1, comes back, maybe in a new key, but still the same motive, coming back here to close it all out. You can see on harmonic plans on that sheet, up here, typical harmonic plans, that it's very common to modulate in the first section. They don't always, but if it does modulate, the 2 places to go are to 5 or to 3. Actually, if you're in minor, there are 2 possibilities. 3 is most common, so if I'm in C minor, I might go to E flat major. But another pattern that happens quite a bit is in minor to go from 1 to 5. So C minor to G minor also happens quite a bit. So if you add that one to our list, motion to 5 in major, to 5 in minor, and to the relative major, 3 in minor. If you have those 3, those are really common schemes. Okay, so if that's true, that we've modulated here, say we're in a minor key and go to 3, it happens a lot. That means this X here is going to be in a different key than this X over here. This will be back in the tonic because you have a PAC in the main key to close it all out, for sure. They're in different keys, but they're still the same material. That means they're balanced. It's like, oh, this was like so, let's put something on to weight the balance and make them the same. It's not quite right for balance, but that's the idea of balance there. You're making them match up and balance each other out. Notice that this has the beginning coming back midway through, but here it's end and end come both back. Now, there are going to be situations where you've got X at the end here, some idea coming back, but rounded trumps balanced. So, okay, these match, but the big news is that you already heard return here, midway through, not there. You heard the return starting here. Maybe this whole section comes back verbatim here. I mean, exactly the same stuff. And you just got some contrast wedged in the middle there. The news, and that can totally happen. You're gonna get balance then. So you're gonna say, now wait a minute, do I call that balanced or do I call it rounded? Call it rounded because the big news is you've already heard the return. The return came there, and that's what you want to reflect in your term. Use rounded. So rounded trumps balanced. If you can say rounded, call it rounded. So rounded binary, balanced binary, and now the third thing is our simple binary. Simple binary is a catch-all. It's for any other situation. But I'm going to give you two different possibilities. Okay, so I might have a couple phrases, and I'll call them A and B. Now, if I do A and B again, then I don't really have a sense of contrast in this section here. I don't have a sense of digression. Now, I'm going to have some sort of contrast harmonically, because there's got to be some contrast to relieve us from total self-similarity. You got to have something fresh and new. But what we're saying is that it's not because the melody, it's not because of thematic material. It's from something else. So it's simple here because I don't have a sense of departure and return. I have the same. There's no departure. It's just repetition and therefore not return. So there's an example of simple. Now here's another situation. Remember, simple is a catch-all. I mean, it's going to catch every scenario that's not rounded and it's not balanced. If I have A and B phrases here, so this would be a contrasting period, not a parallel period, but a contrasting one. Then what if this part just goes on and does something completely fresh and new? Then there's contrast, but there's no pattern of departure and return. And that's what these are trying to capture. What returns? The opening or the end? Anything? Here we don't have that. We have all departure, but we don't have any return. So you can see how each of these two situations lacks departure and return in terms of the thematic material, the melodic content. They're simple. Those are the main ones to know. Those are the ones that come up all the time. You should be aware of these other terms as well. So under harmonic structure, you're going to pick either sectional or continuous to label a period. You might have a rounded continuous period. So you're going to pick one thing from the thematic, one thing from the harmonic structure. And you put those two labels together and you got the complete label. Okay, sectional means the first section ends on the tonic chord in the home key. So if it modulates, like these two schemes up here, say, and our other one in minor going to 5, those happen a whole lot. And if they do, if there is modulation, it can't be sectional. Yes, you might end up on tonic in the new key, but if it's modulated, it can't be the tonic chord in the home key. So that'll throw us over here. It'll be continuous then. If there's any modulation in section 1, it's going to be continuous because that section will end on a non-tonic chord. It could be tonic in the new key, but you see, what we're really looking for is whether we get the tonic chord in the home key. That's the whole issue. You don't have to look, let me mention this, you don't have to look at the next section at all to determine those things. Here's the tricky thing. When you're dealing with continuous with periods, say it's a two-phrase period, if you have a half cadence here, you have to look at the beginning of the second phrase to determine what kind of period this would be. If there's a return to tonic, then it's interrupted. If it's 5 though, then it's continuous. So continuous with periods in the context of periods, continuous, that label requires you to look here at the beginning of the second thing, the second phrase. That's not true when we're dealing with binary form. Here, when we're looking at, we don't have to look at the second section, the beginning of it at all. All we're looking at is the end of the first section. That's a real difference between periods and binary form. So it's the same term, continuous here, continuous there for binary, but they're very different meanings. So just make sure you get those straight and you don't get them confused one with the other. Okay, that'll do it for binary. Let me just go back over what we've said. Binary form, all form, has to do with departure and return. And there are several labels that we have to handle that. We have rounded patterns, balanced, and then simple, which takes care of everything else. Either the opening comes back after some digression, or the ends match, so the end of section 1 comes back at the end of section 2. Anything else fits under simple. They can be continuous, or they can be sectional. Sectional means you've closed off your first section in the main key and on tonic in the main key. If it's continuous, it means you've gone to something other than the main tonic in the home key. Anything else? Any other harmonic goal for section 1, and it's continuous. The main thing is that binary is called binary because there are two parts. It can be two parts because there are two periods. It can be binary because there are two reprises, in other words, two repeated chunks of music. Most of the time, it's both. Now I'm going to go to some examples.